Hello and welcome to the very first lecture on a series of lectures on Lakdasa Wikkramasingha and his poetry. This is actually the first video on this series of lectures on Lakdasa Wikkramasingha's poetry. And in this particular lecture, we will be talking about Lakdasa Wikkramasingha as a writer, his biographical details, his predominant thematic concerns, and his use of Sri Lankan English. So let's first talk about the biographical details of the writer. Lakdasa Wikkramasingha was a simple educated bilingual poet. He attended St. Thomas's College in Mount Lavinia, a private Anglican boys' school. He initially studied law, but later became an English teacher. He published collections of poetry which are solely based in Sri Lanka. He's also a writer who has reached international recognition, and his poetry is included in the A-level syllabuses and a number of university courses in Sri Lanka. He died by drowning when he was very young, when he was actually 36 years of age. So to talk about his work, we see that his first work of poetry, that is called The Last Poems, was published in 1965 and it was written entirely in English. And it is from this collection that we will be analyzing his writing or his poetry in our series of future lectures. He published Janaki Harana and other poems in 1967 and 15 poems in 1970. He has also contributed to periodicals. His poems from the life of the folk poet Isinyu, the Muse, and in ancient Court Malay appeared in New Ceylon writing. His other works were published in the Journal of South Asian Literature and Navasilo. In 1975, he published O Regal Blood, and in 1976, The Grasshopper Gleaming. To honor a poet of the previous generation of Sri Lankan artists, Wikkramasingha edited and then privately published 12 poems to Justin Darajitala. So Wikkramasingha has mentioned this in terms of writing in English in his collection of poetry called Lusty Poems. So he has said that I have come to realize that I am using the language of the most despicable and loathsome people on earth. To write in English is a form of cultural treason. I have had the future to think of a way of circumventing this treason. I propose to do this by making my writing entirely immoralist and destructive. So when you read this statement, you would think that this is a statement which comes across as very rebellious and very radical. So that is true, but we also have to understand that this was published in his collection of poetry called Lusty Poems, which he actually published when he was a very young writer. So yes, it's the original collection and it is something he has actually mentioned by himself. But therefore, that is the reason why a lot of critics tend to look at his work in a completely anti-colonial lens. But that is not all what his writing is about. So from one angle, we can certainly say that as a Sri Lankan English poet at the time, he's actually responding to the hegemony of the English language and its association with British imperialism because English is our colonial inheritance. And also considering the context of the poems, because Lusty Poems was published in 1965 and Sri Lanka only received its independence in 1948, we can say that he's trying to resist the colonial inheritance and he's trying to resist the colonial oppressor. But as we said earlier, that is not only what his writing is about, because he writes about social criticism and commentary. He writes about social injustice, about the exploitation of his own social class, of the Valawa, because he's actually from a well-to-do family. And one of his very popular poems, which is called The Death of Ashanti, published in 1975, is actually a poem which deals with these thematic concerns that I just mentioned about. Apart from that, in this lecture, I also want to discuss the way in which Lakdasa Wikkramasingha tries to make his writing authentically Sri Lankan. So to discuss this in detail, let's go to the next few slides. So the critics on the Sri Lankan English poet Lakdasa Wikkramasingha has said what you can see on the slides. So Wikkramasingha's poetry reflects the authentic Sri Lankan sensibility through recreating an intrinsically Sri Lankan experience. And the scholar Arjun Parakrama in his essay claims that Lakdasa Wikkramasingha is the only poet who has produced a substantial body of verse that intervenes, influences, relates, and responds to the urgent and even compelling needs of the post-colonial present. And De Silva has said that, yet even at the time Wikkramasinghe started publishing, in the mid-1960s, Sri Lankan English, that is SLE, was still only being used for comical and satirical purposes. Meanwhile, the highlights of the literary scene at the time were such poets as Patrick Fernando, who used an unambiguously British English. So when Wikkramasinghe steps into the literary scene and gives integrity to Sri Lankan English by using it in his poetry without irony, it is understandable that contemporary critics would hail this as a pivotal contribution. So basically what all these critics whom I have quoted are trying to establish is that Wikkramasinghe bases his poetry entirely on the context and experience of Sri Lanka as well as the Sri Lankan subject. So therefore, critics say that there is an indigenousness, that means a connection to the place or the region of birth when it comes to the Lankan experience, which is portrayed in his poetry. So this can be perceived when it comes to deliberations on the local context, socio-political issues and injustices, which come in his very popular poems such as From the Life of the Folk Poet Isinho and The Cobra. So in these two poems particularly, in terms of linguistics, you see that his use of the local variety of English or Sri Lankan English by deliberately incorporating the direct translation of simple to English in certain lines of the poems, rather than the standard British English, can be reflected in terms of his use of Sri Lankan English. So considering that the well-known Sri Lankan English writers at the time, such as Patrick Fernando, who is known to use standard British English in his literary work, using the local variety of English or using Sri Lankan English is very important when it comes to Wikkramasinghe's poetry because he was able to significantly contribute to the development of the field. So this is where I'm going to stop my very first lecture on Lakdasa Wikkramasinghe, and in our next few lectures, we will be analyzing his poetry in depth. Thank you very much for listening.